The fire-based disaster curse spirit, Jogo, is one of the most interesting and underrated characters in Jujutsu Kaisen. Narratively, I find his dynamic with his fellow curse spirits and goals to be quite interesting, and in terms of power, he's really only viewed by the audience as quite the middling curse because of the quality of his opponents. When facing off against Gojo and Sukuna, the strongest characters in the entire series, anyone would look like fodder, but what if this wasn't the case? In his final fight in Shibuya, it stated that Jogo was not only an impressive fighter relative to those that Sukuna had seen for the past 1,000 years, but that if he changed his mindset and followed the proper path to strength, he would have even reached the heights of Satoru Gojo. In this video, I'll be continuing my full potential series with Jogo as the focus. How strong could he truly have gotten? Could he actually have rivaled Gojo? And if so, how? I'll be answering all of that and more in this video, so kick back and relax as I talk about the full potential of Jogo. Out of all of the characters that I've covered in this series so far, Jogo has been one of the most interesting to discuss and research for. As with most characters in the series who don't reach their full potential, his early demise is due to a mix of poor circumstances and incorrect mindset. In terms of raw objective potential, he's one of, if not the greatest characters I've covered in this respect, only being rivaled by Geto in terms of room for growth and improvement. As mentioned earlier, one of the smartest characters in the series put it quite plainly: Jogo could have become a cursed spirit that existed in the same tier as Gojo. He could enter the domain that most sorcerers in history could never hope to. In order to wring this potential out of him, we need to change his outlook on sorcery and power as a whole. We're still going to have him lose to Gojo and experience everything that took place in that fight. While in the canon, it's what discouraged him from thinking he could attain that level of power. In this scenario, Jogo is going to witness this and approach it with a mindset more similar to Mahito's. Mahito faced off against Sukuna, recognized his overwhelming strength, but didn't let that deter his pursuit of power and enlightenment through his torment of Itadori. For Jogo, we're gonna say that Gojo's triumphant victory simply allowed the cursed spirit to come face to face with the depths of power that a character can reach. The curiosity, revenge-based mindset, and burning desire for growth would overwhelm him and drastically influence what he's willing and able to do in terms of interpretation of himself and his curse technique, and that's where me and my controller come in. If you aren't familiar with this series, you may not be aware of exactly what I mean by this, but to put it simply, from here on out, I will be taking control of Jogo's movements and path to power in this hypothetical, all in the pursuit of making him as strong as possible. Now, if I took control of Jogo and is basically trying to grind out levels before a big boss fight, there are 3 major conditions I'd make sure that he clears with his training before setting up that rematch with Satoru. The first and most simple is just getting more firepower. I know it seems obvious, but even before getting more creative or refining the abilities that he already possesses, what I think would be extremely important is just making sure that Jogo can hit harder than he already does. Now, we know that Maximum Meteor can theoretically damage 15-finger Sukuna under the assumption that it lands, but we also know that Sukuna can outclass Jogo even when it just comes down to making and outputting fire. So how do we get around that? Well, the obvious answer is by increasing Jogo's overall cursed energy reserves and his cursed energy output. If we're able to get him to do this, not only will Jogo's Fire Blast pack a bigger punch, but his strength, speed, and durability will also see a massive boost as well. This then begs the question, how do we get Jogo to increase his cursed energy? Well, the way that I think would help him the most is by awakening or gaining some greater level of cursed energy control. Finding the core of cursed energy or having a switch in mindset has shown itself numerous times in the series to be a key factor in unleashing latent potential. Yuji, Nobara, Megumi, Gojo, and several other characters in the story have reaped the rewards of resolve and determination, and Jogo himself would likely receive a massive boost in ability upon deciding to become the strongest himself. Landing a Black Flash would also fundamentally change Jogo's control over cursed energy and probably shoot his output, reserves, and refinement into the stratosphere. It isn't something that he can pull off with 100% certainty, but if in training with one of his fellow cursed spirits he was able to tap into the Black Sparks, we're looking at a completely different curse altogether. Another way to significantly amplify his attacking power is through a binding vow. Disclosing the specifics of his technique would make him grow even stronger in combat, but even more importantly than that, Jogo could sacrifice something, in this instance a form of life, in order to give his attacks an extra punch if necessary. Mei's Bird Strike is an amazing example of this. By giving up the life of an otherwise ordinary crow, Mei is able to bring out ridiculous amounts of cursed energy from it, so much so that it can one-shot a low-level special grade cursed spirit. Now, we can safely assume that when these crows are not in the midst midst of a binding vow, they are normal. So the increase in striking strength that these birds get by putting their life on the line is an exponential one. It is by no means linear. While Jogo doesn't necessarily have birds that he can control, using his ember insects or any other form of Shikigami would allow him to use their lives as a bargaining chip. Based on Dagon and his domain, Jogo's use of ember insects, and Gojo's statement regarding Shikigami creation, it's more than possible for Jogo to create more Shikigami types and add them to his arsenal for diversity and binding vow shenanigans. Due to the fluid nature of binding vows and their returns, I can even see Jogo nuking a battlefield by giving up, say, a limb and detonating it. We've seen Jogo cut off his own arm to escape Gojo before, and the loss of an arm from a curse as strong as he is sure to create quite the explosion. If a mere crow's life can damage a special grade with the right vow, the arm of Jogo or the lives of whatever creature he spawns would be deadly to most characters in the series, and as a curse, regrowing whatever limb he decides to give up is an extremely easy feat. Exploring the binding vow route even further, Jogo could create a vow that remains consistent with his current glass cannon status. For all those unaware, while Jogo is definitely superior to the likes of Hanami in overall combat, we do know that he can't survive anywhere near the same amount of punishment as him. He gets around this canonically by being faster and hitting harder, so we'll build off of that and take it a step further. Rather than allowing this to just be the very nature of his durability, we're going to incorporate a binding vow and an intentionality to it. With all of his new cursed energy reserves in control, he should be able to significantly add to his overall resilience to just make him an extremely durable and hard to hurt fighter. Instead of doing that though, we'll have him create a binding vow. In exchange for not amplifying his durability beyond a certain limit, his speed and regenerative abilities will see a massive boost. Inspired by both Naoya and Nanami, this limitation of your abilities in one area to increase it in another is something that I think would help Jogo in dealing with characters that previously would be much too strong for him. This is a somewhat risky strategy due to how strong the upper echelons of the verse can be, but it's a risk worth taking as far as I'm concerned, because the added speed granted from this binding vow would likely allow him to avoid most attacks powerful enough to take him out anyway. You may be thinking that I left out an attacking power boost with this binding vow, but here is where signing, chanting, and reciting incantations can come in. If you're a manga reader, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're an anime only, you do too, although you probably just haven't thought about it like this because the story hasn't framed it in this manner. When it comes to Jujutsu, the goal is to eliminate as many steps of the process as possible. Creating the biggest bang with the least amount of hassle is optimal, and it is reflective of the skill of a cursed spirit or sorcerer. However, if you as a user of Jujutsu are willing to give up the convenience of the speed of your technique's activation, you can greatly amplify the potency of your attacks. We see incantations cast with curtains, and we see signs used with domains. The reason for both being that Jujutsu of a certain level requires some level of signing for just about every character in the series. The reason someone like Gojo only uses one hand sign to cast a domain, as opposed to everyone else using two hands, is likely because his sixth size grants him the greatest cursed energy manipulation in the verse, and so he's able to reduce the amount of effort into opening a domain by half as much as everybody else. By doing the opposite and leaving no part of the casting of your technique out, you are able to amplify yourself by 80%. For context, this means that the boost in strength you get from going through a full incantation is 2 times greater than Nanami's overtime boost, 4 times as powerful as the amp you get in a domain expansion, and 4 times more potent than the potential unlock that a Black Flash gives you. Even if Jogo was up against a character who could tank his Fire Blast, it's more than likely that with a full chant he'd one-shot them. This comes with the risk of being attacked or slow down your ability to cast sorcery, but when you have attacks that can cover a range as wide as Jogo's, it honestly doesn't even matter. You could take a technique that's already super large scale and slow like Maximum Meteor, go through the full chant and incantation, launch it, and still obliterate your opponent even if they started running well before you threw the attack, just due to the radius that it'd take up. Simply put, through training, binding vows, potential awakenings, and chanting, Jogo's firepower would skyrocket beyond belief. So much so that I wouldn't consider it to be an exaggeration that just based on output alone, he would enter special grade sorcerer levels of power. Now, this is all well and good, but it's still nowhere near enough to make the full use of his potential. In order to do that, we need to move on to the second step of the anti-Gojo plan. Making full use of Jogo's talents requires a little bit of research. he would need to take a page out of Mahito's book and start reading, and I mean this in the most literal sense possible. Books on fighting fire, science books about fire, the effects of fire on air, the effects of it on humans, how fire-type characters are used in pop culture, what effects volcanoes have, everything and anything that Jogo can learn about his ability is something that could expand his power and his knowledge of how to utilize it. And I say that because Jogo can't possibly realize the full creative and scientific extent of his curse technique unless he has the present information to do so. Just as Mahito tests out idle transfiguration on humans to improve his refinement and gain new ideas, Jogo must utilize the knowledge of humanity, test that knowledge against those very humans, sorcerers, and even his own allies, and come to informed conclusions about what he can really do. In order to put my money where my mouth is, I did the same thing, and wow, Jogo could be something serious if you really get into the weeds of what he can do with fire and volcano manipulation. Just so y'all get a grasp on how cracked he could be when approaching this ability from a scientific perspective, let me list off a couple of his abilities. Post the book reading arc, Jogo would be able to emit several forms of poisonous gas, including carbon monoxide, uses fire abilities at such a large scale that the oxygen in the area would literally be burned up, cause local heat waves so potent that it would give you a heart attack, make people spontaneously combust due to the heat of the area, compresses blood so much that it takes on the form of a laser-like plasma, and a ton of other stuff. Everything I listed here is just an effect that volcanoes, fire, or heat can have in real life and create in some form or another. And the great thing about all of this is the fact that Jogo would be able to extend his technique enough so that he can accomplish these things. The nature of sorcery is based in talent and interpretation. We know for a fact that Jogo has the talent, and in this scenario, we'll be giving him the knowledge from the human world that would allow him to expand his interpretation as well. Just think about that for a second. At any moment, Jogo could simply output a lethal amount of volcanic smoke that would be enough to poison and kill your average sorcerer. If that somehow didn't get the job done, Jogo could then combo that by merely creating a small spark and lighting the literal air on fire due to the flammability of the poisonous smoke, creating a sure hit without even needing to cast a domain. The concept of doing that may seem insane to some, but for manga fans, you know that this level of sorcery is possible. Kashimo does something similar in nature with his lightning. In this case, the reason the attack can't really be dodged is because the amount of flammable gas in the air would essentially make the incoming fire omnipresent and unavoidable. If Jogo wasn't really feeling that strategy on any given day for any given reason, he could also just attempt to burn you out of oxygen. By focusing on creating large swaths of heat rather than concentrated blasts of fire, Jogo could use up all of the oxygen in the surrounding area as fuel for his flames, leaving none for whoever he is facing. A side effect of this heat would also be the negative health effects that come with intense heat waves in general. The dehydration and fatigue would literally cause your body to shut down or malfunction in crazy ways. With the first step, I really focused on how much more potent his direct attacks could get. In this step, I'm demonstrating that Jogo doesn't even really have to directly touch a sorcerer to take them out. What's great about this too is the fact that even RCT users would have some trouble dealing with Jogo's poisonous technique applications. While reverse curse technique can heal poison, it's been shown or stated many times that it's significantly harder to filter out those toxins, and it requires a level of control that's extremely advanced. To make matters worse, or better if you're Jogo, all of these abilities come to fruition when just looking at science. If he used real-world jujutsu applications of this technique as a building block, he could go even further. Heat-seeking Shikigami that explode on impact, volcano summoning spam in order to continuously catch opponents off guard, temporary self-ignition to make even the act of hitting him back a painful experience, expelling fire from extremities other than his hands to add versatilities to his movements. You can even take some inspiration from Genos and Shinra if you wanted, and have Jogo expel fire from certain points of his body to propel him and artificially increase his movement speed and agility on some cursed Naoya shit. He could take inspiration from his cursed brethren as well, recreating Dagon's ring of water with fire, shoot out small ash-like projectiles that ignite with cursed energy as the fuel, replicate piercing blood by compressing his own fire and heat to create a piercing plasma-like attack, create miniature meteors which would exchange overwhelming attack potency for something that's still extremely strong but much quicker and easier to launch. He could take inspiration from Hanami's flower offering and absorb ambient heat in the air to charge up a cursed volcano. So long as Jogo has a growth-oriented mindset and is willing to keep experimenting and testing himself, his potential is almost almost boundless. Now there is one more potential expansion or addition to Jogo's Rolodex of abilities, but even as the #1 Jogo fan and maker of this video, I know that it's a bit out there. Certainly not impossible, especially when you factor in his potential, but you'd really have to make Jogo a student of sorcery to get him to do this on his own. For anime onlys, skip to this timestamp. For manga fans, what we thinking about Jogo changing the target of his technique on some Sukuna shit? To clarify, I'm not saying Jogo would be able to bypass the Limitless in the way that Sukuna did with his curse technique. Rather, the concept of Jogo potentially choosing to target a character's cursed energy reserves rather than physical bodies is something I find to be quite interesting, if a bit far-fetched. We've seen sorcerers change the target of their own jujutsu before, but it's never been done in this way particularly, and it's only really been done by super knowledgeable or super talented characters like Kenjaku, Gojo, and Sukuna. In Gojo's case, he's able to set up an automatic targeting option for techniques, with him technically being the target. Kenjaku does something similar with the anti-gravity system, as he uses his own body as the domain to amplify its potency. As we all know, Sukuna does the same thing with his slashing attacks, targeting not Gojo or Infinity, but space, existence, and the world itself. These three characters are the inspiration for this cursed energy targeting idea, because in my head, Jogo could whittle down sorcerers or opponents with monstrous amounts of cursed energy like Yuta if instead of burning a Kotsu himself, he temporarily changed the target of his flames to Yuta's cursed energy, burning it up like kindling. This is super broken and honestly would put Jogo beyond every character besides Gojo, Sukuna, and maybe Kenjaku in my mind, but the problem is about the actual logistics of it all. For starters, I'm not even sure if targeting cursed energy exclusively is possible. I would assume that it is if targeting existence itself can be done, but it's not something that I'm entirely sure of. The second problem actually comes down to the difficulty of pulling a feat like this off. In each example listed, the character in question has some distinct advantage or attribute to them that probably allows them to do such a crazy thing. In Gojo's case, he had the 6 eyes, and even then, it took him an entire year to get that down properly. Kenjaku is a master of barriers and has been a sorcerer for 1,000 years, which isn't something that Jogo can so easily trump in a few months or even a few years himself. With Sukuna, it took Mahoraga being a model case, and that's on top of the fact that he already had cursed energy control and manipulation that's on par with Gojo. While I definitely view Jogo's cursed energy burning as something simpler than all of the aforementioned cases, he also has significantly less time, knowledge, experience, and skill with cursed energy, so it makes it quite hard to make heads or tails of it all. If you want to assume he can do this, just add a super broken ability to his already wildly hacked tool belt. But if you think this is too much, even for potential on his level, I honestly can't blame you, and you can sort of just ignore this as an option altogether. He's still broken without it, but he just becomes a genuinely terrifying and nearly unstoppable beast with it. Now initially, I viewed fire-based powers as somewhat difficult to really pull latent abilities out of, but in doing the research for Jogo, I found that this curse could truly become an unstoppable, untamable monster. Greater firepower, ridiculous range and versatility, attacks that can't be avoided even outside of a domain expansion, and so many different ways to keep that growth train going are all available and accessible for a character like Jogo. Speculating on what he could be, what he could make of sorcery, not only makes me appreciate him more, but also the power system as a whole because of the freedom that it grants to those who take it. But even still, even with all of these abilities and cracked techniques and extensions, we're still not quite there yet. As I said earlier in the video, there are 3 steps to the grind before I can have Jogo rematch Gojo. First, we had to beef up his physical stats and overall attacking power. Next, we had to expand his technique and give him a level of diversity and moveset that rivals or even surpasses Gojo. And the final thing we need to do is get Jogo decked out with a real refined domain expansion. Domain expansions are kind of tricky when it comes to Jogo in particular. It's not so much that Jogo needs to gain a domain, as he already has one, and a decently powerful one at that. But what he needs is to refine the domain that he already has, so much so that it can clash against the upper echelons of the verse like Gojo and Sukuna, or at least guarantee that he isn't being immediately overwhelmed as he was in his first fight with Satoru. Now, I say it's tricky because improving domain refinement isn't something that we've seen too much in the story quite yet. Contrary to what we've seen with cursed energy improvement and technique improvement, we haven't seen too much what it takes for a sorcerer or cursed spirit to improve the capacity for their domain. Based on what we do know about about domains and what constitutes being more refined though, much of what Jogo would have to do is brute force trial and error. Expanding his own domain and clashing against Mahito, Hanami, and Dagon for practice could certainly help improve his abilities, and asking fake Geto about barrier usage definitely seems like something that could fast track its growth. Mahito in particular is noted to be pretty bad with barriers, but even he is able to cast a domain and pull off some pretty high level stuff. So if Jogo's ability to pick up on domain amplification is anything to go off of, he should have a decently high ceiling for what he could do in regards to the barrier aspect of sorcery. It'd take quite a bit of time to truly reach the pinnacle of domain usage, but I'm sure Jogo could get around it or at least speed up his evolution through some binding vows. We all know that domain expansions generally have a very fortified internal structure that doesn't allow for easy escape, but something like this might not be necessary for Jogo if even entering his domain cooks most sorcerers. With his cursed energy levels and output rising beyond belief, I could even see a grade 1 sorcerer being unable to do much but burn within the confines of Coffin of the Iron Mountain. Because of this, Jogo would be free to forego the domain's internal hardness in exchange for more potency and better clashing ability. One thing he could also do is take some inspiration from Gojo and Mahito's domains, specifically their sure hit abilities. We haven't gotten to see much of what Jogo's sure hit technique is due to Gojo overpowering it rather quickly, but Jogo adding the poisonous smoke into a sure hit effect, making it so that his opponent's lungs immediately fill up with it, makes his domain something that you either counter properly, heal from with advanced RCT, or immediately lose to. Dagon's domain expansion, the smallpox deities, and even Megumis can be countered to some extent with sheer brute force, but if Jogo aligned his sure hit more with Gojo and Mahito's, he could make the simple act of existing within his domain a death sentence for any sorcerer unlucky enough to be caught within its range. Couple that with all of Jogo's techniques and physical abilities being amplified to their max, and you got a character who's shaking up the balance of Jujutsu society right there. If Jogo had the proper mindset, and me to make sure he follows the right potential unleashing procedure, I have no doubt in my mind that he'd at least be a top 3 threat in the verse. You might want to argue that Jogo still has trouble dealing with characters like Gojo and Sukuna, but I honestly think that I'd place him in that tier. Gojo may be a bad match in particular for Jogo, just because Gojo and Infinity is a bad matchup for anyone, even outside of Jujutsu Kaisen, but I honestly can't think of a character that Gojo can beat in JJK that this version of Jogo couldn't. Can't miss attacks outside of a domain, poison, ridiculous base firepower, compressed fire to shoot off a piercing plasma, maximum and minimum meteor, heat-seeking bug shikigami, a ring of fire, self-ignition, constant volcano spamming, chanting to create a nuclear bomb-like explosion, air combustion, spontaneous combustion, self-combustion, fire-based propulsion. He'd actually just become a walking armory of techniques and extension abilities, and out of all of the characters I've talked about in this series so far, Jogo might just be the strongest with his full potential unleashed. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much, and let me know how strong you think Jogo would be able to become down in the comment section. Is he top 2 in the verse, or would Gojo still be strong enough to keep him out of that spot? I got several more full potential videos coming down the pipelines and soon, so if you enjoyed this and want to see more, subscribe and hit the bell. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.